Number 10, boiling. Yeah, throwback to the Middle Ages when we would boil people. Awesome. Any Game of Thrones fans out there? Some of this is too accurate. In 1531, the time King Henry VIII was unfortunately running the show, they made boiling a capital punishment. Say no more. I'm never breaking the law, ever. Not even thinking about it. Poisoning somebody back then was equal to treason, obviously. Therefore, it was agreed that you should be boiled, slowly, might I add, if you were caught tampering with a royal's beverage, their IPA. Know what I mean? You drop a little bit of something in there, you're out. You're getting boiled. That's horrible. That's the worst thing I've heard today. Number 9, the Battle of Zappolino. Turning the calendars back a little further, this time to 1325, the Battle of Zappolino was a large-scale event over a bucket. Yeah, I wish I was joking. War of the Oaken Bucket, that's also what it's referred to as. This beef was between two Italian towns, Bologna and Modena. It all kicked off when soldiers from Modena snuck into Bologna with intentions to steal. What are they gonna steal? Are they gonna steal the Declaration of Independence? No, they're gonna steal a wooden bucket from the city's well, because, you know, resources were quite sparse back then. If you steal a bucket, that's equivalent to stealing, you know, something big. That's like a pretty big heist back then. The Bolognese declared war then, obviously, and then sent in an invading force of 30,000 foot soldiers, as well as 2,000 cavaliers. The city of Modena had a smaller army. They only had 500 infantrymen and 2,000 cavalry forces. Thing is, these guys, they still won. Yeah, even though they had the lower force, they still got it. These guys chased the larger army way back to Bologna while destroying every town in the process. Now, some recall them bringing the bucket back just to taunt the city, which is pretty horrible, but I kind of am like, yeah, you know what? I kind of would too. I don't know. The bucket is currently on display still in Modena, so if you want to go see it, there you go. Go grab the kids and the wife. Say, hey, we're going on a trip. We're gonna go see a bucket. Yeah, bright and early. Number 8, the hottest wedding in town. It's January 28th, 1393, and you are formally invited to a masquerade ball. Oh, how lucky are you? Let's do this. The French Queen Isabeau of Bavaria is hosting one of the most lavish parties of the decade. When the French royal court was celebrating the marriage of one of the Queen's ladies in waiting, it was a big deal, right? It was a happy day. For some, the best day of their lives. For others at this ball, not so great. King Charles VI, he had 5 companions perform a dance, this, you know, theater routine. They did a performance dressed as beasts. They were committed to the bit, I'll add. They had masks, they had big baggy outfits, lots of linen, and lots of stuffing to appear as if they were real beasts. Good stuff, right? So far, we're having a great time, a dazzling time. The party was going well, wine was spilling, beasts were roaring, but one rule was put into place before this party even started. Absolutely, positively, no candles. Yeah, what an obvious fire hazard that would be, right? Well, the Duke of Orleans, he had a little too much fun prior to this event, and he forgot the first rule of Fire Club when he arrived. The guy walked in with a lit torch. Some accounts say that he dropped the torch by accident, others say that he got too close, trying to guess the identity of one of the beasts. Either way, flames were spread fast, and this tragic event took the lives of 4 people in total. Hence the name, you may recognize, Ball of the Burning Men. Number 7, medieval pub night. Okay, it's almost the weekend now. We're starting to get ready to see friends, maybe hit up the local pub. Now, imagine for a second that it's the 14th century. What are we doing, right? You and your friend decide to hit the big city, the big medieval city, right? Check out one of those hot new medieval taverns that every peasant from the north keeps talking about. Now, you can't get an Uber quite yet, so instead, here's what you should expect. For starters, unless you somehow had a horse in the 14th century, bravo, it's like having a Tesla. Nice, must be nice. You were walking quite a ways just to get to the tavern. And if the commute didn't kill you, the disease waiting in the city probably would. Living in the medieval city was horrible. It was isolated, it was dirty, it was filled with rats, crime, strict curfews had to be put into place. Violent crimes would happen all night long. Number 6, Roman punishments. This was a form of capital punishment used, of course, in ancient Rome, and also used in the Middle Ages as well, but its origins go back quite a ways. Yeah, metal would be heated up in a cauldron for a very long time, just hot metal, to the point where it was molten, just a soup of minerals. And at that point, they would pour said molten mineral soup down the throat of the accused. Yeah, this is why you don't break the law in the Dark Ages. Say no more. This was for the worst of the worst, obviously. It was execution by molten metal. It was supposedly done to wealthy Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus back in ancient Rome. So yeah, like I said, the OGs go way back. The metal would burn your muscle inside, literally cooking it from the inside out, and after a few moments, of course, it would harden and you would, yeah, horrible, I agree. Let's hit that thumbs up, get the karma back up, get that energy back up, and let's move on. Number 5. Plague rats. Yeah, just kidding, it's all disgusting. Say we go to the medieval pub, right? Say we beat the odds and we arrive. That's a feat in itself. We reserved a table, we're in, now you're with your friends and family, drinking ale, having a great time. Well, it'd be a shame if, say, hundreds of rats started to swarm your feet out of nowhere, right? That'd be pretty mildly uncomfortable while you're trying to eat some soup. Yeah, the plague rolled, or rather crawled, into town back in 1328, and it lasted until 1350. And it was actually horrible. It was so bad. We think of our own plague here in history and we compare it, and I'll tell you one thing. I never saw any swarms of black rats attacking anyone's feet. Didn't see that once over the past few years. By 1530, the European population was reduced by 1/3, and rats were almost entirely to blame. These hairy balls of disease, they passed it on to everybody. They didn't have public transit back then, right? We weren't sharing offices, we weren't spreading disease that way. It was rats running rampant just under your feet. That's disgusting. Number 4, Combat of the 30. Now this battle was arranged beforehand, right? It was bring your shiniest armor and your most golden gal and arrive fancy looking and meet us at the battlefield in Brittany. Both sides got to pick 30 champions each. They had to pick the best knights in all of their land, all to battle each other. One side represents the King of England, the other France. Now this whole thing was arranged by a captain in the French banner named Jean de Beaumanoir. Now this event pulled in a crowd, drinks were served throughout said crowd, and this fight lasted a very long time. Again, it was entertainment. Hours went by and 4 French knights had fallen as well as 2 Englishmen. So they took breaks. It was like a sporting event, really. And by the end of the whole thing, the English ended up surrendering after losing 9 knights, and the French in total lost 6. Number 3, Bacchanalia. Have you ever dreamt of joining an ancient Roman wine cult? Me neither. But in the 2nd century BC, it would have been a perfect time to maybe go and try it out. Ancient Romans, what they would do back then, they would gather in these cultic celebrations, all in the name of Bacchus, the wine god, right? Of course, let's all meet and get naked and drink wine. These gatherings would be held in private, thank God, or quiet areas of the woods. A little creepy, imagine bumping into that. And what they would do is they would dance, they would cook food, eat, drink some more, maybe drink a little too much, and then things would get a little wetty. They would get a little intimate, if you know what I'm saying. That was the whole point of this Roman cult. You'd gather in small homes to dance the night away, you could say. Some accounts say people would often get poisoned in these ancient wine parties, so by time 186 rolled around, the Roman Senate voted to end these cult gatherings entirely. Number 2, a lot of cheese. 1837, President Andrew Jackson, he knew this, okay? He was ahead of the game. He knew cheese was the main event, so during his last White House party as president, officially, he ordered a 1,500-pound brick of cheese. Then he invited 10,000 of his closest friends, who I hope weren't lactose intolerant, and they all went to town. They made history that day, literally. To move such a unit of cheese to the White House from New York, let's talk about that. Here we go. Officials had to use 24 horses just to move this thing, and it had to sit for 2 years before they could even open it up and dive in. Prepared for 2 years and gone in 2 hours. And finally, number 1, pleasures of the Enchanted Isle. If you think Elon Musk is wasting time and resources, you should have seen King Louis XIV. What a mess. Back in May 1664, King Louis XIV decided to throw a big celebration for his mistress. He told all invited that the party was for his mother, but really the spotlight was on his lady the entire time. How mean is that, right? Already you're like, ugh, what a diva this guy is. This party though, it was a week long. How exhausting is that? Louis went above and beyond to keep the party going. He had fun outfits, a massive fake palace, a big float that looked like a whale, because that's fun, I guess. And of course, to cap it all off, a ballet show, just to finish the week-long festival. And while setting off fireworks on day 7, however, the fake palace caught real fire. And at that point, everybody was ordered to go home.
Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. together. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand. Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, Mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up, mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly. Instead, they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled. Starting us off at number 10, we have mummy unwrapping parties. So we already know that people love to do all kinds of weird and strange things with mummies back in the day. But after people widely stopped eating them or using their remains to make medicines, a new mummy trend began. After Napoleon's first expedition to Egypt in 1798, Europeans began to become even more enthralled with mummies than they ever had been. In the 19th century, a mummy craze began. Travelers began bringing back whole mummies they had bought off the street in Egypt, and the next thing you know, they were no longer thought of having medicinal purposes, but rather being a wonderful party activity. Soon it became customary to hold mummy unwrapping parties, and wealthy Victorians would gather around as the host slowly unwrapped the dead body, showing off his wealth while simultaneously giving guests a thrilling evening filled with horror and delight. I have no clue what was done with the mummies after the public unboxing, but somehow I almost think it's better, as I'm sure whatever happened next was even more disgusting. Number 9. Bomb shadows. We all likely know and were taught about the devastating bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed 226,000 people in 1945. But one thing that you may not have learned about was what those bombs left behind. Apparently, as the attack was happening, the light and heat from the weapon was absorbed by the people and the objects in front of it. The surrounding light and heat then ended up bleaching the areas of the ground where nothing had been, leaving objects and people-shaped marks on the pavement. They became known as the shadows of the dead, and even now, after nearly 80 years, some of the shadows remain stained into the pavement and walls all over the city, as a reminder to the human capacity for destruction. Coming in at number 8, Vlad the Impaler. Born into a royal family in 1431, Vlad III was son of Vlad Dracul, the ruler of Wallachia at the time. During this time, Transylvania faced a lot of battles and bloodshed as the Ottoman Empire kept trying to push west towards Europe, and the Christian Crusaders marched eastward towards the Holy Land. In 1442, Vlad Dracul was called to a diplomatic meeting with the Ottomans and brought with him his sons. But the meeting was a trap, and all three were arrested and held hostage. The father was granted to leave as long as he left his sons behind, and he agreed. So for the next few years, Vlad and his brother were trapped and tortured, although they did also strangely tutor the men in science, philosophy, and art, as well as turn them into warriors. Eventually, his brother and father both died, and Vlad was released. Soon after, he became the leader of Wallachia, and when the city of Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, Vlad led the force to defend his land from an invasion. It was during this time he became known as Vlad the Impaler, as he often used metal or wooden poles to impale invaders right through their chest, or sometimes he would even insert it vertically up the victim until it pierced through their shoulders, neck, or mouth. While well respected, he became notorious for killing thousands of people, and eventually became the inspiration for Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Count Dracula. Coming in at number 7, incubators. Nowadays, incubators are seen as life-saving devices for premature newborns, but shockingly, this was not always the attitude towards them. During the early 20th century, most physicians kind of held the belief that premature infants were not meant to survive, and so they were tragically just kind of left to die in most cases. But Martin Cooney held a different belief from his peers and wanted to try and change the narrative. But in order to do so, he had to make it a spectacle. One thing that people loved to do back in the day was gawk at the unusual, laugh at the different, and it's for that very reason that science sideshows existed. So in order to save the lives of the preemies, Cooney decided to display them in what he called hatcheries as a sideshow in Coney Island. For a quarter, visitors could gaze upon the peculiar and small young people, and over the years he managed to save more than 6,500 lives by packaging up their safety in a swallowable pill for the times he lived in. After so much success, doctors started coming around his ideas, and now they are used by hospitals around the world. Next up at number 6, Pharaoh Pepi. Although the exact timeline is up for debate, somewhere around 2278 BC to 2216 BC, Pharaoh Pepi II reigned in Egypt. The ruler succeeded the throne at age 6 and became widely known as being one of Egypt's most demanding kings, which comes with little to no surprise that a literal first grader being given the power of a pharaoh affected his ego in a negative way. Often he demanded outlandish tasks of his slaves and subjects, but most strange of all was his practice to keep flies off of him. Apparently he hated flies more than anything in the world, so Pepi would force several slaves a day to be covered head to toe in honey and then stand naked by him in hopes to attract the bugs towards them and off himself. By the end of their days, his slaves would be covered in bites, boils, and sores caused by the countless insects that swarmed to them, and soon they would often succumb to diseases like malaria. Later on, flies actually became more or less a creature of high esteem for the Egyptians, becoming a symbol for persistence and tenacity, but for the near 90-year or so reign under Pepi, they were apparently the worst creature alive. Coming in at number 5, a cat phone. In 1929, a pair of scientists at Princeton University had a question. They wanted to test out how the auditory nerve perceives sound. But in order to test that, they had to find a subject. Now, as you can imagine, not too many people were lining up for this, so they ultimately decided to perform the experiment on a cat. The cat was heavily sedated prior to the operation, where the scientists cut out parts of its brain before attaching one end of a telephone wire into its auditory nerve and the other end into a receiver. Shockingly, the cat survived the operation, and the scientists went forward with their experiment. To their delight, they discovered that if you spoke into the cat's ear, you could hear it perfectly through the receiver. But their initial success was not enough for them. Next, they had to know if it worked once the cat was dead. So they killed the cat to test their theory, but sadly the cat phone no longer functioned without access to a functional brain. Despite its rather gruesome story, the two did actually contribute to a valuable understanding of the brain and helped future researchers in development of cochlear implants. So at least it wasn't all in vain. Coming in at number 4, death photography. Memento mori means remember you must die. For centuries, trinkets were used to keep the thought of death close and to help the living through their grieving process. In Victorian times, this looked like lockets filled with hair of the dead, a mask of your loved one created out of wax, or by having paintings and sculptures made in their memory. But all of a sudden, a new invention came along that led to creating an all-new kind of memento mori, the photograph. As its popularity increased, the price of having your photo taken was all of a sudden cheaper than a portrait, and many began using this new technology to keep the essence of their loved ones preserved forever. Next thing you know, families are getting photos taken with their dead family members, and for many, it was even the first time getting a photo taken. The dead were sometimes propped up to look alive, while other times eyeballs were painted on after it developed to give them a more lifelike look. The pictures would be hung in the house just like any normal family portrait and served as a reminder to the family of the ones they lost. Thankfully, the practice went out of style as healthcare began to improve and less people were dying so young. Coming in at number 3, gibbeting. During medieval times, the practice of execution was really just an average Tuesday afternoon, and even darker was that it was pretty common practice for criminals to be left on the gallows after they were hanged, as sort of a warning sign to the others in the town. But another form of torturous death they made criminals endure was called gibbeting. The ancient practice consisted of humiliating and hanging a criminal from a large post, but unlike being hanged, the convict was stuffed inside a small cage that that was left dangling in the air. The victim would be put in the cage completely alive and essentially left to rot, while people of the town gathered round to witness the spectacle, often even torturing the criminal in their own ways. Eventually, after starvation, cold, and muscle atrophy, they would die and their rotting bodies would be left inside the hanging cage for weeks, sometimes even years, until nothing but their skeletons remained inside. Eventually, the practice was outlawed by the mid-1800s, but some say that if you walk past an old gibbeting cage, you can still hear the screams of the soul who died inside. Coming in at number 2, chats with a severed head. In the early 1900s, a French physician named Gabriel Baudieu was interested in exploring the connection between mind, brain, and body. So in 1905, when the execution of Henri Languille was announced, he rushed to the guillotine to study the aftermath. Baudieu claimed that after the guillotine dropped and the head fell to the ground, he called out to the victim and the severed head allegedly blinked his eyes as if awakening. He wrote, "The eyelids lifted up, this time I swear, in a distinctly normal movement, slow as if awakening or torn from thought." He further detailed that the pupils focused in on him until slowly the eyelids faded closed. But once again, he called the man's name and his eyes opened. Some believe that it was simply leftover nerve impulses, but Gabriel swore that the head could hear him and understand him. He said he felt something looking into his eyes and knew it wasn't just a coincidence. And last up today, the Leningrad famine. For 872 days, the people of Leningrad suffered one of the most destructive military blockades in history. In just a little less than 3 years, the population dropped from 2.5 million to just 800,000. In September of 1941, they were bombarded by the Axis powers and cut off from the outside world, receiving no wood, no gas, no coal, and no food. And it only got worse once winter hit. Soon they were trying to stay alive with no food in negative 40-degree temperatures, and so many resorted to burning their possessions just to evade death one more day. But as time went on, it only got darker and darker. People would leave their homes and never return. At first, many assumed they died in the cold, but suddenly it was happening more and more frequently. It didn't take too long to draw a connection to the mysterious disappearances, as the next day there would magically be meat available at the market, usually labeled as horse or dog. Soon after, people began killing firsthand, just to feed themselves, and some were even driven to kill their own families just to survive. Officially, there are 2,000 recorded cases of eating human flesh, but it's believed to be much higher. All the while, of course, the elite hoarded food that came into the city via the lakes and never once went hungry. There are journal recordings from the same time about eating goose and caviar at a party, while the commoners froze to death in the streets.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the Teapot Dome scandal. Ah yes, what's a list of cover-ups without a good old story of bribery? Albert Fall was the Secretary of the Interior to former President Warren G. Harding, and while in this position, he decided to secretly allow oil companies to tap into the Teapot Dome oil reserve in Wyoming and the Elk Hills oil reserve in California. Of course, the reason he did it is because he could make a ton of extra money doing this, like several $100,000. This all started to unravel though in 1922 when there was an expose that revealed the oil had been sold without any sort of competitive bidding. After this expose, Robert La Follette, who is a senator in Wisconsin, created an investigation into the story by the Senate Committee on Public Lands. The Attorney General at the time, Harry Dowdy, began to get some flack for not investigating this alleged corruption, so Harry turned to the FBI director to help him out. The FBI director, William J. Burns, sent an agent to Robert, the senator from Wisconsin's, office to search for anything that could have been used to blackmail him into stopping the investigation into the corruption. Despite this seemingly obvious threat, Robert knew this meant that his investigation was going to reveal something serious, which motivated him to continue on with it. In the end, the shady dealings and bribery was revealed and Albert Fall was officially exposed. This entire ordeal led to him being the first United States cabinet secretary to go to prison. In our number 9 spot today, we have the Dreyfus Affair. In 1984, France's government and their army were in some hot water for a series of scandals that had recently happened when a janitor discovered papers that revealed just another scandal to add to the list. This janitor had found papers in a garbage bin of a German military ambassador that revealed that there was a French officer who had turned against them and who was spying on the Germans. When this came to light, they needed a way out of the mess, so they decided to use a scapegoat, a man named Alfred Dreyfus. Alfred was a Jewish officer in the French army, and they decided to accuse him of this spying and the selling of secrets. His trial was huge in the media, and he ended up being sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, and really hateful and prejudiced groups used his as an example of a quote-unquote unpatriotic Jewish person. Later, the chief of military intelligence would uncover evidence that proved who the real spying culprit was, but when this happened, the chief of military intelligence was removed from his position by his superiors to try and keep the secret from getting out. It is said that French authorities tried to suppress these accusations, but a novelist named Émile Zola continued to accuse the army of a cover-up. People were torn at this point. Some people swear that Alfred was still to blame, while others were convinced he was innocent. In the end, the fight became more about principle rather than whether or not Alfred was really innocent or not. There were 12 years of controversy surrounding this case until Major Hubert Joseph Henry ended up admitting to forging the key documents before taking his own life. The case was finally reopened, and while Alfred was found guilty again, he soon received a pardon from the president. A few years after this, a civilian court of appeals found Alfred innocent, and he went on to have quite an army career, and he even fought with honor in the First World War. This was a scandal that really did change French politics forever. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Ford Pinto. Introduced in 1971, the Ford Pinto would go on to become the car with the worst safety reputation, but of course, not without an attempt to cover up all of the flaws first. During the car's development, during the final stages, there was crash testing being conducted, and this is when designers found out a flaw with the car. Basically, through their tests, they found that the fuel tank's filler neck had a tendency to be torn away, which would then spill gasoline under the car, as well as the fact that the tank itself was able to be easily punctured by nearby bolts. To fix this issue, it would have cost about $11 per car, but instead of spending that money, they decided to just do nothing. Yeah, they just said F it and figured that it would cost less to pay off the people who bought the car and had the issues that caused their car to catch fire. Sounds absolutely insane, and thankfully, an investigative reporter by the name of Mark Dowie thought so too. He went through a ton of paperwork that lay in the US Department of Transportation's file cabinets, and this is when he found what he was looking for. A memo where the company calculated that settling the lawsuits brought against them would save the company $70 million rather than just installing the new parts and fixing the issue for everybody's safety and well-being. Mark wrote an expose on the story, and once published, a jury in Orange County, California awarded $125 million in damages to a man who'd been injured in a Pinto that caught fire. The ruling was later reduced to just $3 million, but it did kickstart the end of the car and the beginning of the scrutiny that the company would face. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Prohibition poisoning. You probably already know about the Prohibition era, but if not, this was a time period where there were restrictions placed on the consumption of alcohol, which was done with a ban being placed on the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol by the US government, and this lasted from 1920 to 1933. In knowing about the Prohibition comes the knowledge that this ban certainly did not stop people from producing or consuming alcohol, it was just done in sneakier ways. The black market for alcohol was booming as people began to drink redistilled industrial alcohol instead. This is all pretty well known, but one super sketchy thing that is definitely less well known is something that government agencies did to curb the black market sales of alcohol. Basically, they poisoned the industrial alcohol that was being repurposed for drinking, and not just poisoned in a way where the drinker would get sick, which is already horrendous enough, but they poisoned the alcohol with lethal chemicals. It is thought that by the time the Prohibition ended, at least 10,000 people died from this. This event is still one of the strangest and deadliest decisions made by government officials. In our number 6 spot today, we have the health risk denial. In this day and age, everyone knows that smoking cigarettes isn't great for your health, but back in the day, people didn't know, and the tobacco industry did everything they could to make sure that they never found out. In 1950, a physician and epidemiologist, Dr. Ernest Winder, published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association that pointed out the links between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. This is something that is well known and studied now, but at the time, this was news to much of the public, and to hide it, 6 major cigarette companies began to fund their own research efforts in response to the study. The study wasn't aimed at actually getting to the bottom of the health risks, it was just a research project meant for publicity reasons. In reality, they already knew about the health hazards and that there was a possible link to cancer. In a 1953 survey of scientific literature, a man named Claude Teague, who was a chemist for R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, concluded that, quote, studies of clinical data tend to confirm a link between the heavy use of cigarettes and lung cancer. A scientist for a major tobacco company at the time knew and had studied the links, and they were still trying to cloud the public perception of this huge issue. The entire strategy was later revealed in a 1972 industry memo, which described it as, quote, creating doubt about the health charge without actually denying it. Finally, this madness was brought to an end, sort of, when the attorney generals from 46 states joined together in one massive lawsuit against the tobacco industry. As a result of this, while they can continue to make their harmful product, in 1998 the companies agreed to pay $10 billion annually to make up for the damage that they had done. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Chernobyl disaster. In April of 1986, crew members of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine were running a test to see how long a reactor's turbines would continue to supply power in the event of an electrical power outage. This test, however, went famously wrong due to a malfunction caused by a power surge. This caused overheating of the water inside of the reactor, which released a buildup of steam and thus explosions. These explosions caused radioactive debris and gas to be released into the atmosphere for the following 10 days. The story of Chernobyl is famous now, as it is one of the largest nuclear disasters in history. There were immediate deaths and more that followed shortly after, but there also has been a countless number of effects seen throughout the years it's been, and the area still remains dangerous due to the contamination. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, however, Soviet officials, because at the time Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union, they didn't publicly admit that the accident had happened at all. For 2 days, they kept totally quiet about this extremely dangerous thing, and it only came out when Swedish officials rang the alarm bells, as they had found increased levels of radiation that had drifted 1,000 kilometers westwards over to them. You think at this point they would have just fessed up, but of course not. The Soviet leader at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, waited 3 weeks before even publicly mentioning the accident. Who knows what level of effect this might have had in a multitude of ways. In our number 4 spot today, we have the safety cover-up. Karen Silkwood was an American chemical technician and a labor union activist who was very vocal and often raised concerns about the corporate practices that related to the health and safety of those working in a nuclear facility. You would think that this is something that all of those working in the field would be concerned about, but apparently not. She worked a job making plutonium pellets and was the first woman on the union's negotiating team, and after she testified to the Atomic Energy Commission about the things she was concerned about, it was discovered that she had plutonium contamination on both herself and in her home. Plutonium isn't an issue outside of the body, but can easily be ingested or inhaled, which is when it creates a major problem for humans. Karen was driving to meet with a New York Times journalist and an official of her union's national office after deciding to go public with some of her findings, and the people who saw her right before she left for this meeting saw her with a binder full of documentations of her findings. During her trip in her car there, Karen ended up driving off of the road and striking a culvert, and this accident took her life. Here's where things get really suspicious though. That binder I just mentioned was never found. It was said that Karen had fallen asleep at the wheel and that almost twice the recommended dosage of methaqualone was found in her system. But there were clear skid marks on the road which suggested Karen was trying to get the car back straight on the road, and despite the accident being entirely at the front of the car, there was damage to the back of the car that friends and family say wasn't there before, and paint chips were found, which would suggest a car had hit her from behind. To make this whole thing even more suspicious, apparently Karen was receiving death threats before her passing. There have of course been claims of foul play and claims that she was run off the road by another vehicle, but unfortunately with little to no evidence these claims have never been able to be proven for sure. But what is for sure is that whatever really happened to Karen, it seems like a simple accident doesn't cover the full truth. In the end, however, because of everything that went on with Karen, the Department of Energy opened an investigation and ultimately shut down the facility. In the end, although it is so horrible that Karen lost hers, she definitely saved countless others' lives. In our number 3 spot today, we have the Pentagon Papers. In June of 1971, the New York Times published a few different excerpts that were taken from a top secret Department of Defense report that pertained to the United States and their involvement in the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967. These papers were created as a part of a study by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and the reason they were so important and secret is because they revealed that 4 consecutive presidential administrations had lied to and misled both Congress as well as the American people about their involvement in the war. Daniel Ellsberg, who is said to have been a military analyst who opposed the war, leaked these confidential government records, and him, as well as the New York Times and the Washington Post, all faced criminal charges in court for their efforts to get the papers into public knowledge, but in a turn of events the charges were later dismissed. Not only were these papers important, but the leak was a crucial moment in time because it bred major distrust in the United States government that would only go on to grow. In our number 2 spot today, we have Operation Paperclip. I suppose this is less of a cover-up and more of just a secret operation, but this one was kept a secret not for the safety of the people, but instead to prevent an uproar from the public. This operation began in 1946 when the President of the United States at the time, Harry Truman, authorized it. Basically, the entire point of it was to lure scientists from Germany over to the United States after the Second World War. This was done in an effort to aid the country in their post-war efforts, as well as to ensure that the valuable knowledge these people had would not end up in the hands of perhaps the Soviet Union or either side of the divided East and West Germany. Had it not been classified information at the time, this would have been highly controversial, as many of these people were involved in, and sometimes even leaders of that hateful party we won't mention by name again. Former President Truman stood by his decision, saying that because of the relations with the Soviet Union, quote, "this had to be done and was done." Several of the scientists a part of this program were later investigated because of their former ties, but one was only ever tried out of the over 1,600. None of the paperclip scientists were ever found guilty for any crimes either in the United States or in Germany. Perhaps the most famous of all of the paperclip scientists was Wernher von Braun, who really played a huge role in advancing NASA's Apollo missions. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Watergate scandal. It's perhaps one of the largest scandals and leaks in history, especially in the history of the United States. In the middle of 1972, there were 5 men who were arrested for breaking into and subsequently trying to bug the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate Hotel complex in Washington, D.C. As the year went on, the 1972 presidential election came closer, and there was an anonymous source who fed information to Washington Post reporters that, quote, "the Watergate bugging incident stemmed from a massive campaign of political spying and sabotage conducted on behalf of President Nixon's re-election and directed by officials of the White House." Despite this information leak and it being reported on the news, Nixon was still re-elected, but he was also under serious investigation. There was a series of Senate hearings, and the Senate even went on to create a special investigative committee. The hearings were broadcast nationwide, and they had witnesses testifying that Nixon had approved plans to cover up administration involvement in the break-in, and that there was a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office. These hearings captured the attention of Americans everywhere for weeks, and in the end, the United States Supreme Court ruled that Nixon had to release these Oval Office tapes to government investigators, which then went on to reveal that he had not only attempted to cover up what went on, but he also later tried to use federal officials to deflect the investigation. Under the threat of an imminent impeachment, Nixon had no choice but to admit his guilt and resign, making him the only president to do so. His successor, Gerald Ford, ended up pardoning him, so he escaped prosecution, but there were 69 other people indicted, with 48 of them later being convicted.
Starting us off at number 10 is divorce. Well, today you can pretty much get a divorce for, well, really any reason you want. That wasn't always the case. In fact, prior to being able to file over irreconcilable differences like most couples do now, pretty much only men were allowed to divorce their wives, not the other way around. Unless, that is, the wife could prove her husband's impotence, as it was seen as a woman's legal duty to to bestow a child to her husband, if he couldn't give her the goods per se, she could file for an annulment of the marriage. But how did the court go about proving this, you ask? Well, of course they couldn't just take the woman's word for it, so they would bring in a witness, usually a sex worker, to try and arouse the man. That, or the court would enter your marital bedroom and, well, you know, see for themselves just how well the man could get the job done. If he did in fact have any issues completing his manly duties, the woman could be freed of the marriage. Just be careful they don't accuse you of becoming a witch. Next up at number 9 is man-made fertilizer. The Battle of Waterloo in 1815 resulted in the death of an estimated 60,000 soldiers, but not many of these bones have ever been recovered, and the reason why is pretty grim. In a strange, twisted series of events, the English decided to clear the field of the corpses and put the bones to use in a rather effective, but albeit creepy way. Newspapers of the time reported that the fallen French army were ground up in Yorkshire factories and the bone dust was added to their manure. Apparently the oil from the marrow proved especially helpful in the grave robbing turned fertilizer plan, and the fertilizer was purchased by farmers across England and scattered widely to help grow their crops, meaning that an entire generation of England ate food made possible with the help of dead French soldiers. Coming in at number 8 is Qin Shi Huang. Before the understanding of modern science, there was a lot of ideas about elixirs and remedies that have quite literally no logic to back them up. Now, of course, it wasn't their fault. They truthfully didn't know any better. But looking back, that doesn't make it any less wild. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was one of the many intent on finding the elixir of immortality, and so he demanded his royal doctors find this magical potion for him, otherwise he would have them killed. I mean, just real low stakes stuff. Eventually, likely under the duress of not wanting to be killed and also probably not knowing what they were doing, they offered him a magic potion that they promised would bring him eternal life. The magic potion, however, was actually just mercury, and the emperor ended up dying from poisoning himself. A bit ironic that in the pursuit of eternal life, he actually only made his life shorter. Coming in at number 7 is Henry Rathbone. During school, we all learn about John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln at the Ford's Theater in Washington. But did you know that that wasn't the only tragedy to occur due to that night's events? In the theater with Lincoln that night was his wife, along with Henry Rathbone, a military officer, and his girlfriend Clara. At the time of the assassination, Rathbone saw Booth and tried to save Lincoln, but Booth stabbed him before he could reach the president. Although he physically survived the attack, he left with a deep-seated guilt about not being able to save the president's life. 2 years went by, and despite trying to move on from the tragedy by marrying Clara and starting a family, his mind never fully recovered and he became more and more paranoid about the world around him. He began claiming to hear voices speak to him from behind the walls that would taunt him endlessly, until eventually they pushed him towards complete breakdown. Convinced it was the only option, Rathbone shot and killed his wife before stabbing himself in an attempt to take his own. But just like before, he survived the attack on himself. Eventually he was tried for killing his wife and sent to live the rest of his life in an asylum. Coming in at number 6 is an animal trial. So not only did they have trials over the impotence of a man, believe it or not, you could also take a literal animal to court in the Middle Ages. I kid you not. The whole kit and caboodle would be present. A judge, prosecutor, witnesses, a defense attorney. They truly took it very seriously. The reasoning behind it all, I suppose, was that at the time, law prohibited punishment without trial for everything and everyone. The first recorded instance was the prosecution of a pig in France in 1266, accused of eating a young boy. The pig was found guilty for his crime and executed as punishment. If that doesn't sound crazy enough, keep in mind the judge would hold the behavior of the accused animal against it. And if the court didn't feel the animal was acting properly, that was taken into account. These trials were only put on against domestic animals, as they truly believed, having been in the company of humans, they should know how to act. Now, not all animals were executed for their crimes. Some lesser criminals were merely excommunicated from the church or cursed and sent to live in the wild, but it's still crazy. I mean, honestly, I wish I was making this up. up. Coming in at number 5 is John Scott Harrison. Raised by the 9th President of the US, William Henry, and the father of the 23rd President, Benjamin Harrison, although John Scott himself never rose to presidential ranks, he did serve 2 years in Congress and was a prominent political figure in his time. But one day he decided politics wasn't really for him anymore and spent his last 20 years managing a farm in Ohio. After his death in 1878, his family gathered for the service and took great pains to protect his grave. At the time, grave robbing was at an all-time peak due to the demand for cadavers in medical schools. To avoid having his father be another subject of this, Benjamin had an unusually deep grave made and placed a massive stone that required 16 men to move placed on top of his casket. For extra measure, he then covered the whole ordeal in cement, then placed small wooden pegs below the surface of the covering so that he could tell if it had been disturbed. Oh, and he hired a security guard to watch it day and night for the next 30 days. After noticing a nearby family friend's grave had been exhumed, Benjamin and his nephew went to go and track it down. They managed to obtain a warrant for the Medical College of Ohio and with the help of a detective went to retrieve the corpse of their dear friend. When they arrived, they found a dissecting room on the top floor, but to their surprise they couldn't find who they were looking for. Instead, they happened upon a body that looked strangely familiar, and when they removed the rags covering the head, they were horrified to discover it was the corpse of one Mr. John Scott Harrison. How the grave robber managed, we will never know. Next up at number 4 is La Custa. The Pax Romana is known for being one of the most peaceful times in history. The Romans had pretty much conquered what they set out to, and so they began to, just chill out for a bit. Then along came La Custa, esteemed maker of poisons and the world's first serial killer. Well, more like a hired assassin by the Roman Empire. Locusta was routinely caught poisoning people and despite frequent arrests for her killings, was always let free. Why is that? Well, the Empire got word and decided they could use her to their advantage. Her first big gig came from Empress Agrippina to kill her husband, Emperor Claudius. Locusta complied with glee and assassinated the emperor. However, soon after, Agrippina threw her under the bus for the crime. But now, under the ruling of Lord Nero, he saved her for his own devilish plots. For the next 15 years under Nero, she worked consistently and was even awarded for her service. Locusta received a villa and even a small staff to help her in her poisonous endeavors. Nero even went as far to provide her with her own school for the profession. But after Nero was sentenced to death, Locusta lost her security blanket and lawful immunity and was executed by the emperor for her crimes. Coming in at number 3 is Gilles de Rais. Joan of Arc is rightfully so credited as a certified badass and patron saint who was a major defender of the French during the 100 Years' War. Among her most supportive and trusted allies was Gilles de Rais, an esteemed knight in the French army who was appointed the highest military distinction one could receive at the time. But if he was such a big deal and close companion of Joan, why isn't he as widely celebrated? Well, that's because sadly he was actually super evil. By day he was defending France beside Joan of Arc, but at night he was into the senseless killing of minors in occultist rituals. Often he would lure the unsuspecting victims in with psychological torture, convincing them that it was just a game, before bludgeoning them and doing other cruel and unspeakable things to their corpses, supposedly using them for his rituals. Eventually he was found out and tried for his crimes, admitting to all his vicious acts and hanged as punishment. Although no one knows for sure, it's suspected he had nearly 150 victims. Coming in at number 2 is virginity tests. Back in a time when a woman was merely the property of her husband, there was one very important thing that needed to be assured before the wedding night: that she was pure. Mostly because it was believed that the consummation in fact kind of sealed the whole husband owning his wife deal, and if she had done it with anyone else, she didn't really belong to him. Charming. So to ensure that their potential wife was worth the dowry, suitors would perform virginity tests on their brides to make sure they weren't getting a second-hand woman, if you will. Such tests included inspecting their urine, as it was believed a virgin's urine would be clear. Other times they would give the woman a special potion, and if she could refrain from peeing, she was a virgin, as if a bladder was any indication of that. Sometimes a physician would be hired to inspect the woman's downstairs area, as they believed they could literally just tell by looking at it. Most common though was to inspect the sheets after the marriage was consummated. If there was blood, hooray! Hooray! A virgin. If not, well then it was assumed she was a liar and her husband was legally entitled to compensation for being swindled into marrying her. And last up today are syphilis zombies. Sometimes it's easy to forget just how much antibiotics have changed the world around us. While nowadays a shot of penicillin can keep an early onset of the STI at bay, back in the day it could quite literally be the end of you. In fact, in 1494, Italy experienced one of the worst outbreaks in history, and if you didn't know any better, you might have thought it was a zombie apocalypse. Of course, before there was any kind of real understanding about how these types of diseases could be spread or caught, people were, let's just say, having a lot of fun with each other. But on the flip side of that, if they caught the infection, it would cause flesh to literally dissolve off their bodies until their inevitable death within a few months. It was also widely believed that bedding a virgin could cure you of the disease, so that's fun. Apparently, it was not uncommon to witness people missing hands, feet, eyes, noses, or look as if they'd been dropped into a vat of acid while walking down the street. Also remember that it took a few months before the disease actually killed them, so they were just living in excruciating pain while their flesh was slowly eaten away, in some cases right down to the bone. With that image in mind, it does make a little bit more sense as to why they believed you would go to hell for premarital relations. Like, I kind of get why they thought it was the devil punishing you for your sins. Thank God for antibiotics. Starting us off at number 10 is the Judas cradle. The medieval times are known for a lot of stuff, and one of those is their insanely gruesome torture devices. Back then, if you'd found out you were facing the guillotine, you could actually breathe a sigh of relief, because trust me, there were far worse ways to die. One of these horrific devices was called a Judas cradle and was used to interrogate prospective criminals into talking, and often would result in their death one way or another. Victims that faced this torture would be stripped of their clothing, bound, and then lowered slowly onto a pyramid-shaped spike that, depending on your downstairs parts, would be aimed at different areas, I'll just say. Any movement at all would only make the pain worse, so if you weren't telling them what they wanted to hear, they would often rock the victim back and forth, tearing them further open, and they would keep victims here as long as it took, sometimes even overnight. But what about the death part? Well, if you didn't die from injuries received during the torture, or frankly just blood loss, then most died from infection. You see, the spike was never really cleaned, so there was a whole horde of bacteria and disease that would settle onto the spike, inevitably seeping into the victim's nether regions. How fun, right? Next up at number 9 is cruentation. The Middle Ages had many interesting ways to handle justice, much of which I think we are all incredibly grateful is illegal nowadays. One of these such practices was called cruentation. Essentially, back then they believed that corpses retained a tiny spark of life after death, and so they were therefore revered as magical entities. Just imagining that they saw rigor mortis and decided that the corpse was somehow still alive. But how did this involve their judicial system? Well, with the idea of using the corpse's magical powers to their advantage, they would place an accused killer in contact with the corpse of their alleged victim. And if the corpse started spontaneously bleeding when the convict was in its presence, it was seen as confirmed evidence that they were guilty of the crime. This actually remained a completely legal practice until the late 17th century, but thankfully somewhere down the line they figured out that maybe a dead bleeding body couldn't be used as proof to convict someone of killing. Next up at number 8 is slug soup. Listen, I love just about all the creatures on the planet, and I don't have it out for slugs or anything, but I have never been able to look at one without feeling nauseous, so this actually sounds like a personal version of hell to me. During the Crusade battles, Muslims became popular for using aconite to poison the Crusaders. This was obviously causing quite an issue, as at the time there was no known cure. That was until one day when 14th century doctor Guido de Vigevano noticed some slugs munching away on an aconite leaf, and he had the biggest light bulb moment of his career. He collected slugs and boiled them before using the boiled sludge and turning it into a soup. First he tested it on animals, and after successful results there, he decided to try it out for himself. After a bit of trial and error, it turned out to make quite a successful antidote to the poison. But man oh man, does it sound incredibly disgusting. But still, better than being poisoned, I guess. Coming in at number 7 are transitombs. In the Middle Ages, the practice of memento mori, meaning remember you must die, was huge. Memento mori was practiced in many ways: open caskets, churches filled with skeletons of the dead, and years later developed into things like photographing the dead. Their keen attachment to this philosophy likely stemmed from the sheer amount of people dying so frequently due to the overall lack of hygiene, so they had to come to terms with death in a much more peaceful sense than maybe we do now. One of their favorite ways to practice memento mori, however, was with tombs, which were funerary monuments that depicted the deceased in a stage of eerie decomposition. As you can imagine, they were costly, so usually they could only be resurrected after those with high standing or a small fortune in the bank. At the time, there was an existing belief that the earthly body was merely a transition vessel of the soul, and that after death the spirit would be resurrected. And so in creating these tombs that resembled the decomposing dead, they figured it would help the soul move on more quickly. And while I'm not opposed to all of the reasons behind it, from the modern lens, it is a bit morbid to have statues not only resembling the dead, but looking like zombies lining the streets, and I'm just glad this practice went out of fashion. Coming in at number 6 is bloodletting. Back in the day, the medical practice of bloodletting was used by medieval physicians as they believed it would literally let the bad blood out of the body. This belief is mostly derived from the Greek physician Hippocrates and his theory of the four humors. The four humoral theory centered around the belief that inside the body there are four main humors or liquids: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm, and that any imbalance in these liquids was what caused health issues or even changes in temperament. So where bloodletting came in was that there was this belief you could let out blood in order to balance out these liquids in your body again. Now, while this theory was definitely a stepping stone in modern medicine, many argue could be considered a precursor to blood transfusions, the way that it was being done was without any real scientific backing, and without any understanding of just how much blood was safe to let out or from what vein or artery was the safest. For example, people were so into the practice at the time that they would base which day was best for bloodletting on texts, usually advising to pick a saint's day. It was also popular to rely on charts showing which parts of the body were best to bleed from according to their zodiac. So as you can imagine, the practice did not always end well. Coming in at number 5 is Saint Francesca Romana. During medieval times, fornication in any other context than between a man and his wife, and for the purposes of procreation, was considered a sin, punishable by life in prison. Now, of course, there were many people that did not take this to heart, but there was one woman who very much did: Francesca Romana. For as long as Romana could recall, she always wanted to become a nun when she got older, but as happened all too frequently back then, her father forced her into marriage at the age of 13 as the man in question was extremely wealthy. At first she was incredibly reluctant, but after she allegedly received a vision from Saint Alexis, she changed her tune and became a dutiful wife, and even perhaps grew to like her husband. But this didn't change Romana's belief about the sins revolving what went on in the marital bed, so in private, wishing to remain spiritually chaste even if she couldn't be in her physical body, she would heat pork fat and burn her nether regions to ensure that she would remain in extreme pain throughout the act and never enjoy a minute of it. This was the only way she believed she could commit the act without sin and remain in the good graces with God. Coming in at number 4 is an arthritis cure. This one actually blew my mind when I first came across it. According to an 1896 news story in the Smithsonian, one day a drunk man was on a beach with some of his friends when he spotted a rotting whale carcass. Because he was drunk, he thought it'd be super funny to dive right into it. And he did. His friends waited for him and finally he came out, but he reported something incredibly strange: that his rheumatoid arthritis was seemingly gone. This sparked a national craze in Australia, and once word got out about the healing powers of the whale carcass, the town of Eden became a worldwide destination for people suffering from the condition. Visitors would be lowered into a freshly dead whale through a hole which would be sewn up, and it was advertised that if the person could stay inside for 20 to 30 hours, they would be cured of their pain. I have to imagine that you would need to be in so much pain to give this a try in the first place, because the thought of spending an entire day inside of a dead whale just seems wild. That being said, it's not all a bunch of hogwash. There is reason to believe that the rotting whale would have acted like a sweat box of sorts, potentially relieving some of the pain, but truthfully, I don't see how this could cause any kind of permanent fix. Let's just be grateful there are some other options out there today. Coming in at number 3 is a brutal execution. As has already been established, one of medieval Europe's most notorious strengths was figuring out the most gruesome way to either torture or kill their citizens. And if you thought that the Judas cradle was bad, then wait until you hear about this one. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was a method of execution far worse than any other. At least with practices like the guillotine, it's over quickly enough, but with this one, it was quite literally drawn out just to make you suffer. First off, the victim would be tied to a wooden panel and dragged, or drawn, behind a horse to their place of execution. Second, they would be hanged until the point right before they died. Then they would the body, often by disembowelment or emasculating it, while they were still alive before finally beheading them and quartering the body, meaning cutting it into 4 pieces. It was intentionally excessive, as this was a punishment saved for those who committed high treason against the king and was used to instill compliance and fear in the onlookers. It was most popular in 14th century England, although it remained in the rotation of choices until it was abolished in 1870. Coming in at number 2 are changelings. Across Europe, there was an old belief in changelings, which were thought to be evil creatures left in place of young ones stolen by fairies. This was a huge problem for many reasons. Number 1, it was objectively not happening. You see, the main reason that parents believed their little ones had been swapped with a changeling was that their young ones suddenly fell ill, had physical deformities, behavioral changes like advanced knowledge beyond their years, or being mischievous. So essentially, if the young person in question got sick, became intelligent, had a disability, or acted like a normal developing person in any way, it was viewed as a changeling. Tragically, once it was believed that a changeling imposter was in their arms, there was only one way to handle the situation: hurt it in hopes that the fairies would come save the changeling and they would give their real one back. They did things like exorcisms, leaving them in the cold, poisoning them, or even trying to end their lives. And they believed that in doing this, their real little one would be returned to them. It may just be one of the saddest and most cruel practices to have ever existed. And last up, in our number 1 spot, are Ivy League photos. If you thought there was corruption in the high-ranking areas of society before this, then buckle up, because this one might be one of the most insane things I've ever heard. Apparently, for some time, it was actually required for students enrolling in Ivy League schools to have their photos taken in a grotesquely inappropriate fashion. To put it delicately, you are not allowed to be dressed. This dark underbelly came to light in the 1970s when a Yale employee opened a long, locked room and discovered thousands of photos dating back several decades. It was then uncovered that between the 40s to the 60s, it was a requirement to submit what they called posture photos, which were taken from every single angle and forced the subjects to attach pins to their spines under the guise of studying their spines. Some schools, however, practiced longer. Harvard, for example, began in the 1880s and got away with it until the 20th century. Of course, there was a huge investigation about this, and they found that the photos were used in various studies for big tobacco, or that they would use them in books for illustrations, but the creepiest was a professor that admitted the photos were used for anthropological research and were used to study the connection between a student's body type and their intelligence, in what was basically glorified eugenics. Thankfully, most of these photos have since been burned. However, for some reason, there are some that remain at the Smithsonian. I'm just grateful the practice of mandatory nude photos is banned, because actually what the heck is that?